Hey guys, it's Tyler with TCG Rewind. Today I'm doing a video because I was actually watching E3 Yu-Gi-Oh's coverage of his recent 2011 tournament he put on his channel, and during that coverage he had a lot of hot takes on the 2011 format, and I think a lot of it just came from not really playing it that much. And one of the things he said was this, and I kind of wanted to talk about it, so let's give it a listen.
I think most of the matchups in this format are really bad, mostly because of this card right here. People are like, oh, Maxx keeps the format fair. Not really. Not really, because if you don't draw Maxx and your opponent does, and they have a combo and you don't, it's like you can never even come back.
So while I do disagree with what he's saying here, I do understand where it's coming from. And honestly, I think that this perception is something probably a lot of players have when looking at 2011 as a whole. When people look at 2011, they'll sometimes see some power cards in the format and they're like, oh, that's insane. Like they'll see Maxx and in a vacuum, if you look at Maxx across all of Yu-Gi-Oh, Maxx was an extremely oppressive card and actually functioned exactly how he said it. In most of historical Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of times Maxx, when it happened, if you got hit with Maxx, during your combo, you just have to stop, then your opponent gets to combo off and you just lose, right? But that's not really the case for 2011. 2011 is a lot slower and it's a lot more calculated, and honestly there's a lot of really good stopping points for a lot of the meta decks. So I kind of wanted to talk about that today, and I wanted to show you guys exactly what I mean. So I'm going to give you the most detailed description of how impactful Maxx actually is on this format. For those of you that have that hesitancy, oh, I don't know if I want to play a format where Maxx is at 3, I totally get it. I can think of Zoo format where Maxx was a one of, and I remember I'd combo off if your opponent had the one of Maxx. You're just gonna lose on the next turn because you have to stop, otherwise your opponent's gonna draw their deck out. That's just not 2011. In 2011, special summons are pretty rare, and Maxx really doesn't see nearly as much value as it did in other formats. And so I'm just gonna break it down. We're gonna talk about literally every single meta deck. You can even learn exactly when is an optimal time to Maxx certain meta decks. So if you're not familiar with this format, this is a good way to learn how to play certain matchups. So stick around, but yeah, we'll get right into it.
Time warp, go!
Whoa, slow down there. I know you want to get into this video, but real quick, I just want to remind you that currently only 30% of my total YouTube viewers are subscribed. So if you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button so I can keep making you guys some wonderful, beautiful content. Yeah, hit the subscribe button. All right, real quick before I get exploded on in the comments, you telling me the story about how your grandma lost a game because someone drew 5 cards against her when she got Maxx. Just know that I am completely aware and will fully admit that sometimes Maxx can win a game. It can actually just blow your opponent out. You can catch your opponent in a really bad position and you can just win a game off of Maxx. That is entirely possible, right? I want to just make the point clear that that is not a very common scenario. And the examples I'm going to give you are going to be usually the common value that you're going to see off of Maxx these decks at key points. That's why I'm going to show you the builds and the ratios so you can kind of see and understand exactly where we're at, exactly how much value is typically going to happen. There are scenarios where you maybe have Monster Reborn and stuff, you're under Maxx and you have to make a bunch of special summons in a single turn. I just know from playing the format that those scenarios are very, very rare, and kind of unlikely to occur. And so the examples I'm going to give you are the ones that are the most common times where you're going to get Maxx using a specific deck. And I just want that to be clear that yes, it can be more impactful than this, but usually it's not going to be more impactful than these examples. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to give as a quick disclaimer. Let's get into those decks. All right, so here we have all of the tier 1 meta decks of the 2011 format. This is based on the tier list I made in a previous video. If you haven't seen that, I'll put a link to that in the description below. But for now, this is going to be a new list, basically evaluating of these decks what gets hurt by Maxx, what feels the impact within the meta, right? So we're going to go over all these decks, and this is kind of what the scale looks like so you understand. Wrecked by Maxx means that you're almost always going to see value from Maxx. You're going to at least get a +1 off of it, or get like more than that, right? Like, it's where the deck doesn't have very good stopping points, and they usually have to commit to their special summons, which means that they're going to, like, you know, you're gonna feel the pain of Maxx, right? Hurt by Maxx means that, like, there's a lot of points in your deck where Maxx is going to hurt pretty bad, but it's not like it's all the time. So, you know, there's some variable to it, which means, like, it can be good, it can be bad, but for the most part, it's like relatively good to keep in. Like, you would want to keep it in against the deck you're playing. Minimal impact means you're probably siding it out, right? And that means, like, maybe there's a +1 you can get in a rare circumstance, but there's not a lot of cards in the deck that you're gonna see a ton of value off of it. So, like, it's worth siding out. And then no impact means, like, either, like, I mean, basically you're not feeling hurt by Maxx, and you definitely want to side it out, or, like, maybe there's like one card where your opponent can, like, 1-for-1 at best or something, but in reality, like, it's not that great. And honestly, I want to make a disclosure here, because I think this is a good disclaimer to have at the start of this, is Tour Guide is a really weird card in this format, okay? And so I'm just going to talk about Tour Guide first, because a lot of decks run Tour Guide in this format. Tour Guide is not necessarily an optimal Maxx target, like 9 times out of 10, okay? Because, like, it's usually later in the game where Tour Guide is in there. So if Tour Guide is, like, the only card in the deck that, like, special summons, I would say that that would be a no impact scenario, because of the fact that, like, for example, if you're going first and you summon a Tour Guide, you activate the effect, your opponent chains Maxx. You can then just special summon a Sangan and pass, and that's going to be a 1-for-1, but honestly, it's really not that good for your opponent, because you get the +1 of the Sangan, and Sangan's going to search whatever you want later, even another Tour Guide if you want. So, like, it's really not that big of a deal to get hit by that Maxx there. The only time where Maxx is actually going to be a +1 against a Tour Guide is if you've already used Sangan and you normal the Tour Guide and you have to make an exceed play. So, like, technically you can, even if you haven't used Sangan and you know your opponent has to make an exceed play, chaining Maxx will get you a draw 2. So you're going to get a single +1 off of it. But that's a pretty rare circumstance, and it usually happens later in the game. But if that's, like, the only relevant thing in the deck, I wouldn't really count that as, like, oh, this is, like, super impactful, right? Like, it's a small scenario. Like, yeah, it lets them pitch their Maxx, which is probably ideal for your opponent because it's dead in every other scenario. But I do want to give that disclaimer that, like, Tour Guide is kind of a weird card, but it's not going to really be, like, added to this mix, because of the fact that, like, 9 times out of 10 you can just get Sangan instead of continuing, and in the event that you have to continue, it's just a +1, and that's, like, worst case scenario, right? So, like, it's not that great. So we're gonna start with Chaos, and Chaos is actually the main deck. Like, this is a prime example from what I just talked about. Like, Chaos literally, like, only has Tour Guide. If you look at the list as a whole, I'll put it up here real quick. If you look at the list as a whole, every single card is a normal summon or an inherent summon, and you can't chain to the inherent summons. You can't chain Maxx to it. So, like, if you summon a Chaos Orc, your opponent can't do anything. They can't watch you banish cards and be like, oh, I'm gonna chain Maxx here. Like, that's not how that works. So there's no way to, like, know when your opponent's gonna summon the Chaos monsters, but for the most part, everything's just a normal summon. There's not actually a lot of special summoning this deck does, so we're gonna move it to no impact. Tengu Plants is next. That's what the Black Rose represents. And this is a weird one, and I'll probably pull up the scenarios here of what like, how the deck is impacted. So we'll jump to that now. All right, so I have a couple different scenarios that occur in Tengu Plants. Honestly, this deck is so versatile, and there's so many random moments where Maxx is, like, pretty relevant against it. But usually it's going to be when you're forced to commit to a play, right? So let's say my opponent has something I need to deal with on their board. Let's just give them a monster. Let's say they have, like, a Catasaur on board, and I have to deal with it this turn or I lose. Like, maybe my life point's low, right? So I normal the Lone Fire and activate its effect, declaring priority. My opponent chains Maxx. I need to get a glow bulb to out this, right? So I special summon this glow bulb, and then they get to draw a card. So now, in theory, like, you technically, if you weren't like pressed, like if your life points weren't low, if you didn't absolutely need to out this card right now, you could just pass, because you'd have the glow up bulb effect and another Tengu. So if you're maxed out on Tengus or something, maybe there's a world where it's fine. But in the event that you need to synchro, you synchro for 5 into the librarian, because it's a dark that can swing over, and then you so your opponent gets to draw one, and then you have to activate Tengu as a mandatory effect. Now, there are scenarios where this is your last Tengu and this isn't an issue, so you don't give them that extra draw, but that's going to be like the end result is, yes, you can out the Catasaur, but your opponent got to draw, like got a +2 off of it, off their Maxx, right? Because they started with 1 card, now they have 3. So that's like worst case scenario here. But again, that's only if you have to make a push. There are technically stopping points throughout this point, and like the number of Tengus you have is also a variable that like you can't really like track, which makes Tengu Plants such a weird deck to kind of like cover for this. But I just wanted to show that like in reality, like you have to hit Tengu Plants when they're forced to make a play. So like theoretically, if you stopped before any of this happened, your opponent just loses Maxx, you pass, and then your opponent actually gains nothing, right? It just kind of depends on the situation. But specifically, this is like I'm forced to go and do this, which means my opponent's going to draw. All right, now here's where things get a little tricky, okay? And this is why it's like such a weird card to play, and why like there's some like parts where Maxx can be really relevant, but also can be kind of like awkward, right? So this is one of those examples. Let's say I have a glow up bulb in hand. So we don't have the lone fire. We have the glow up with the Tengu, right? If I normal summon this glow up bulb with a Tengu, and my opponent wants to try to get max value off of it, they have to Maxx right here, right? If they want to Maxx. But if I'm not like absolutely pressed to make the synchro play, I can just pass, and my opponent's going to -1, right? And this format, there aren't a ton of crazy OTKs, and there's also back row, so like it's pretty safe to just pass at times, right? Like, especially because Glow Bulb will be live next turn from the graveyard. Tengu will replace itself. There's really not a lot of pressure unless it's like a weird scenario later in the game where I have to make this play, right? So they might not get value out of it, right? So the only other scenario what they can do is hold this in their hand, and I can synchro for my monster, and then they can chain the Maxx to the Tengu effect, which will at least like replace what they got. So if I summon Tengu here, they now like 1-for-1, but that doesn't really generate all that much. In reality, the best way to use Maxx is when your opponent is going for a like glow up bulb play from the graveyard. So like in this scenario, if my opponent was like, if I held this Maxx this whole time, right? If I held that Maxx the whole time and my opponent just did this, and then they go, okay, I'm going to use glow up bulb's effect, and they mill a card, and Maxx gets activated here. Now the special summon happens, and I'll get to draw, and then realistically, since they committed to using the effect of glow up bulb and it's once per duel, they probably want to finish out their synchro play, and they want to synchro into 5, right? Which then means that like you would get to draw again, and then in the case of summoning the Tengu, you'd get to draw a 3rd time. So in reality, you want to use it in response to the effects that happen in the graveyard, and it's really awkward to use on just like normal summons with like Tengu, because your opponent can just stop. So I want that to kind of be clear that like it's not just like perfectly available of like a card that's just like, oh, it's just gonna freeze or stop your opponent's turn. Like there's a lot of things you can do as the player on the receiving end of Maxx to make it like not feel that good, or like, you know, give your opponent a minimal advantage off of it. So there's just a lot of interactions where like in reality, Maxx comes up when your opponent is going for a push like with glow up bulb, but there's like a lot of scenarios where your opponent can kind of seek those out through other means, and I'll show an example of Joe doing that in one of our matches from Tournament of Tournaments. All right, so here is a scenario of Joe playing Tengu Plants against me, and he makes some plays to like try to bait out the Maxx. So we'll kind of watch this turn, see how it plays out, but you're gonna see that like he he tries to go as far as he can to force me to Max C, assuming I have it. And then once he realizes I don't, he goes for a big push, right? So there are ways to play around it, and this is a really good example of that. It's a 2.
Okay. I will use priority.
Sure. So here he summons Lone Fire and goes for this play because he knows that it's probably smart for me to chain Maxx C, as I just showed you, in this exact scenario. So he knows if I have Maxx C, it's a good time to use it, right? But he also is aware of the fact that there might be a world where I try to hold it to get more value out of it later. So he's being kind of hesitant with what he does. I'll special battle figure.
Sure. Ends the battle phase? Yeah, okay. In phase 2.
Mm-hmm.
Just lagging a second, but I need to think anyway. I think this is worth it. Take Battle Fader.
Okay, so on this play here, he knows if there is ever a time for me to Maxx C, it's right here, right? Because once he tributes this Tengu to steal my Battle Fader, I know for a fact he has to get value out of this enemy controller. He has to commit to special summoning here, right? So like he has to at least synchro once for 2. So I'm going to get a Maxx C off of the Tengu and then Maxx C off of like a draw here. But once he sees that I didn't Maxx C at this point, he knows he can just go off. Ooh. And he even vocalizes that.
Oh, no Maxx C? Oh boy.
See, there it is.
Oh boy, that's nice.
Yeah, that's pretty good for me.
Trigger map.
Get the light brain. Get the Tengu. Yeah, this is pretty good for you.
Does it get banished? Banished, okay.
Yes, it's get banished.
Draw some cards.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, you can see he goes on to debate on if he wants to synchro a 3rd time to get an extra draw and stuff. I don't even remember what he ends up doing. But for the most part, now you can see that there is like ways to play around it if you're the player running a deck full of special summons. And it's to kind of do those low committal plays like he was doing. Like he was at 8,000. If I chain Maxx C to his Lone Fire, he would be comfortable stopping there, right? And then at the very key point, he knew I was going to get a +1 off of his enemy controller play at best if he did that and then just stopped, right? So he's thinking very carefully about the windows in which Maxx C is going to be the most punishing and trying his best to play around those and then like fight for the information. Once he confirms, he goes for a bigger play, right? So that's kind of how it works in this format, which makes it like a little like it'd be impactful here for sure, but it's a lot less impactful, right? If that makes sense. Okay, so this next situation is with like 1-for-1. 1-for-1 is going to be like the most brutal punish that Maxx C can have versus this deck, which is if I activate 1-for-1 and I pitch a Dandelion and my opponent chains Maxx C, then I have to special summon. Let's say I special summon the Glow Up Bulb. That would be like the optimal play here. And then my opponent's going to draw 1 off that, and then Dandelion triggers, special summoning 2 tokens, which means I draw again off of that. So that's draw 2 without my opponent actually doing anything, which like this board here is pretty walled up. Again, you can technically pass, but in the event that you would have to synchro, it would be like something like this, where you like make the Librarian, they draw, you get another Tengu as well, so they get to draw again. Like, it's just going to be a pretty big blowout if you're absolutely forced to commit. Like, if we need to go even further, it's going to be like synchroing here for 2, making formula. I don't know if we draw up the glow up, but we'll draw 2 here. Yeah. So yeah, this is like pretty outrageous circumstances where Maxx C is going to see a ton of value. But again, that's like, you could technically stop on like the big wall of a board, but in the event that you had to commit, your opponent's going to draw a lot of cards. But if you can go heavy, like you can like go further, like make a Bryanak, like, and then special summon out the 3rd Tengu and like draw a card, right? Like in this world, like maybe you have game right here, right? Like at that point. So like if as long as they don't have Gores, you can gamble the Gores, take the Maxx C challenge, and like, you know, try to win the game. All right, and here's one more scenario that I want to talk about. This is with like Dandelion plus Debris going into like a Trish. And in this scenario, I'm actually playing like Junk Doppel, which I would say this is like a deck that actually just gets wrecked by Maxx C. Like every single time your opponent swings Maxx C against you, it's going to see a lot of value because this deck just has so many things that you just kind of have to commit to. Otherwise, you're leaving your board in like terrible positions. So yeah, we'll just walk through. I'll show you how Joe plays this out because this is another really intelligent way to utilize Maxx C. But we'll also kind of see what the value actually is at the end. Well, foolish.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I'm going to dump a Dandelion.
Sure.
Affected Dandy, get 2 tokens. So he doesn't stop me here because of the fact, like he doesn't Maxx C on the tokens because of the fact that I can just stop, right? Like if he Maxx C's, I'll just stop. He's gonna 1-for-1 at best. It's not really worth it. He wants to wait and see what else I do to see if I commit to something where he can get more value out of the Maxx C, which I do. I summon Debris. Target Dandy.
Yep. All right, Maxx C.
That's what I was afraid of. Let's see. I get to take 1 card out if you don't.
Yeah, but I draw 2.
Yeah, but I also have board presence, which I otherwise will not have with this board. So here's where my line of thought was going. It's like if I make this Synchro play into Trishula, I can potentially banish this monster plus a card out of his hand. So I take 2, and he's going to end up drawing 2. So it's like it's kind of an even trade, but at the end of it, I walk away with a Trishula on board and 2 tokens. So it's like I'll have a decently sized board to like deal with what he has, which makes it seem somewhat worth because in reality, the trade is going to be even. He started with 6 cards in hand, and then he replaced it off of the summon a Dandelion. He's going to draw 2, but I get to banish 2, if that makes sense. This is another tough place to be in. It feels bad because based on where I'm at here, if I let you Venus and get 3 Shine Balls, you just out pretty much everything on my board anyway. So all of this goes to waste, so it's effectively almost the same thing as letting you draw, because I'm just losing cards instead of you gaining them. You gaining cards is scary. Alright, we'll gamble it. We'll sync with everything. And make the Trishula, and then I'm going to special the tokens back.
So I draw first because of Trishula.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
it was like Trish Chainlink 1 and Dandy Chainlink 2 or something.
I don't know if I can build the chain, because I would definitely prefer Trish to be Chainlink 2.
All right, I have this, so I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to draw off Dandy.
All right, sure. So him having Valor was the only thing that made that a viable play for him, because again, that basically gave him a +1, right? Because he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in hand. He started with 6, and I didn't get to banish that. So like the trade is relatively even, right? So he has 8 cards total to my 7 cards. So he got a +1 on me, right? So it's like an okay trade, right? Like Valor made it good. If he didn't have Valor, it actually was going to be like pretty favorable for me. I think it would have been a fair trade, but that just kind of shows you that like while Maxx C is impactful, it definitely makes the scenario way better. It didn't like blow me out, and it didn't put me in a position where I just lose the game, because like, you know, if I pass, like it's not going to do anything. And he even had, when it took it further, he had Honest, and like I ended up losing my Trishula there. Like he did a ton of stuff, and like after like Gorzing and all this stuff, I actually ended up winning this game. So like even when getting blown out by Maxx C in some of the worst way possible, I ended up like, even while down quite a few cards, I was able to make an Armory Arm Colossal Fighter play and win the game. So like there's plenty of counterplay options, even for decks that get completely destroyed by Maxx C. Like you can find ways to crawl back. It's not impossible, and it's not like as one-sided as people would think, and like it is in other formats. Okay, and then so yeah, after seeing that, like there are scenarios where it is hurt by Maxx C, right? But at the end of the day, like it's hurt by Maxx C. Like I would definitely keep 3-sided in against Tengu Plants. This is one of the main decks that I would want to have it in against. But I don't think it's like completely wrecked by Maxx C. The deck does have some stopping points. It does have some room to play safe. And there's also ways that you can kind of like bait out the Maxx C, or like try to see if your opponent has it before committing to a bigger play. And then, so yeah, but the one thing that's really nice is, of the high tier decks, this is one of the most popular. The fact that this deck gets hurt by Maxx C a lot more than others is actually really good, because this is where it actually does add balance to the format. It means weaker decks can side Maxx C and actually have a pretty decent like matchup against some of the more powerful meta decks. I think without Maxi, like Tengu Plants, decks like Tengu Plants would potentially go up a whole tier. Like they would be so much stronger, but this kind of puts them in check and makes them like a decent, reliable deck. But because Maxi exists, it puts them in a bit of a lower threshold, meaning other decks can catch up. So it bridges that gap and adds more balance to the format as a whole, which is really, really nice. But we'll keep going to kind of show more of that. So Dark World is really only going to see the impact of like Tour Guide into Leviair or Tour Guide into Brow, right? So you Tour Guide into Brow, you bounce the Brow to a special Grapha. That's going to be 2 summons, so your opponent gets a +1 off that Max C. Or you can like Tour Guide into Leviair if they chain on that to get a banished Dark World back and then bounce. Like that's a million draws, so like that's where it can be kind of impactful, but that's like again a rare scenario. And for the most part, Dark World can actually play very slow, and the fact that they potentially run cards like Mind Crush or like even like Drag Down your opponent, like you can kind of snipe those Maxis out of their hand if you're really worried about it. But I would say like the scenarios where you're actually going to have Maxi be relevant against Dark World are a little tricky just because of how the deck plays. So I'm going to put it at a minimal impact because Dark Worlds are really safe to just keep normal summoning and bouncing for Grapha and just making you deal with Grapha. They really don't have to commit to doing things. So yeah. Heroes, this is another deck like outside of chaining to the Miracle Fusion, you're not drawing a card off of Maxi and you're definitely taking it out of your deck. So I would say for Heroes, there's no impact at all. Here's another one. It's Lancer Frogs. I played this against Joe and like in Tournament of Tournaments, and he sided out his Maxis. He was like, yeah, there's like, he like would just use it on a random Treeborn Frog summon because he just knows that like you're almost never seeing value from it. It's really hard for those moments to come up where like the frog player is like making a big extension. I guess you could make a case for like Ronin Totem, like doing stuff there, but like it's so few and far between that like it's just like, and it's not really predictable either. Like you can't know your opponent's going to make a big push with the frogs because like the first one happens in the standby phase. So if you just chain to that, like that doesn't necessarily interrupt anything. So yeah, it's pretty rare. I'd say no impact for Lancer Frogs. TG, we're just going on the list. So TG and TG Stun, we'll put both at the same time. I'll show a play here on the screen, which is when TGs make Trishula. It actually doesn't, getting Max Seed on that Trishula play actually doesn't really generate a whole ton of value. So, which like, yeah, you'll see there. All right, real quick, here's the Striker Warwolf Tengu into Trish play. If you special summon Striker right now and then you declare the effect of the Warwolf, your opponent can then chain Max C, and then you special summon this in defense, your opponent draws 1 card. Technically you can stop right here because if they destroy both, Striker can search Warwolf, Warwolf can search Striker, but if you need to make the Trish play, you normal the Tengu so that doesn't add an extra summon, and then we're going to sync 9 here and make the Trishula. So your opponent is going to get to draw another card, but then the Trishula effect is going to trigger. Oh, and you have to get Tengu, so we get Tengu. So your opponent draws 2 cards, and then Trishula effect triggers again, so you get rid of the monster they have, because they'd have to have a monster in this scenario, and then get a card out of their hand, so we banish that, and then the trade is pretty even. But for the most part, like that play in itself is very rare, and it's not gonna be like game breaking. So like for the most part, you're definitely siding Maxis out against TGs because like they really never special summon unless they absolutely have to, and even then most of those summons are like gonna be inherent or like, you know, a 1-for-1 or like a +1 at best in a very rare scenario, so you're probably cutting that. X-sabers, so floater X-sabers as well as regular X-sabers. This deck is really weird to place on this list, I'm not gonna lie. Knowing the deck as well as I do, this is one of my like favorite decks of this format. I would say that I haven't really had a lot of issues with Max C personally, but I also opt to run like a single copy of Bogart Knight. I think both builds, if it's like X-sabers running back row, like you can just stop because all the monsters in X-sabers are really good and floaty, so they just kind of protect themselves anyway. So like, unless you're absolutely pressured to make a play, like make a bigger push, you can just stop on the Maxx, and it's almost always going to be like a 1-for-1 at best. So yeah, I'll do a whole segment on X-sabers. We'll pull that up in a second, but yeah. All right, let's throw out a couple X-saber scenarios, and this is why it's such a weird card, like deck to place, because it's super situational where Maxx is actually good. Like, I'll give you this example. We normal summon Bogart, we declare the effect. If we do that and they chain Maxx and then draw a card off the summon, like if I special Pashul, for example, like this card can only go into an X-saber Synchro. So like, unless you really need to make that X-saber Synchro, no matter what you summon off the Bogart Knight, most of the cards, like Pashul is just going to protect itself because it can't be destroyed by battle. Full Helm can negate attacks. Dark Soul is going to search a replacement. Ember's Blade will search a replacement. You really don't care, right? Like, you can stop here. Like, unless you're absolutely pressed to make the play, then you're fine stopping here. The only other scenario is if you really, really need to drop the Fall Troll, then this is going to be like this, and then like you bring back something, you know, they draw again. That's where things can get a little dicey, but for the most part, you're never really forced to commit into that play. And like, even if you just have 2 monsters, like if you have like, if you have 2 monsters on board, your opponent has to Maxx because Fall Troll is an inherent summon. So let's say you already have these 2 existing. They have to Maxx like preemptively to get any value off the summon of Fall Troll. The only way they can actually do it is if they chain Maxx to the effect to bring something back. But again, there's so many good stopping points for this deck where it's really, really hard to get a ton of value out of Maxx outside of Bogart Knight. I'll show one other scenario. So this is another really weird scenario on how to place for this deck, right? Because it's super situational when something like this comes up, but this is probably the most impactful you're going to see Maxx be. Let's say you have a low defense monster, a card in grave, and like an Ember's Blade. Like, if I am going to declare like an attack, like I'll go attack the Tengu to crash, and my opponent activates Maxx on that, then this Ember's Blade is going to go to grave. I'm going to special summon out the Full Helm Knight. They're going to draw a card. And then if I attack here, I can special summon back the Dark Soul, killing this, and then they get a draw again. So then if I absolutely had to, I could Synchro and give them a draw 3. But all in all, the card I bring back is going to search something from my deck. And this is honestly a fine stopping point. If I can just have Full Helm Knight try to defend from attacks, like, it's really not that big of a deal to leave the play right here if you're under Maxx. But worst case, you Synchro here and make like a Hunley. Your opponent draws a 3rd card, and then during the end phase, you get a search and X-saber. So yeah, we'll just grab anything. But yeah, so you can kind of see, like, yes, there's a world where they get some crazy value off of it. But that's like a really specific scenario. For the most part, X-sabers are very comfortable stopping at any given point. Overall, I think it's safe to place these at minimal impact. Just because there's so many good stopping points for this deck, and it's actually kind of hard to predict like when they're gonna go off, unless you're seeing like a trap stun be flipped or something. But it's a tricky deck. It's a tricky deck for sure. So okay, now we have agents and TG agents. All right, real quick, while we're on the subject of agents, I just wanted to go over the scenario of Venus. Venus is the main reason why people side in Maxx. And in all honesty, it's to prevent the gotchi, right? Like, or to get value off of your opponent making gotchi. So there's 2 scenarios here that will always happen when you are playing agents, right? The first one is when you pay 500, your opponent chains Maxx, and you get the Shine Ball, and they draw a card. It's a 1-for-1 for them, but you know, you get to keep the, you know, you just got a useless Shine Ball on board. So this prevents gotchi from happening. That's play 1 of 2. Typically this happens if the player with Maxx cannot out the gotchi, like they don't have the means to deal with it. All right, and then the next scenario is if you if you let the first shine ball go through and then chain Maxi to the second. So there's an argument for both, right? But like, so now that I have the first shine ball, I pay 500 on the second, then they chain Maxi, right? Because now I can special summon the second shine ball here, and they're going to draw one, and then I'm pretty much forced to make Gachi here, and they're going to draw again. But if you look at it, it is a +1 for your opponent and a +1 for you as well, which means that it's a relatively even trade. So while it is impactful and can prevent the Gachi, and in that way it would be impactful, I do technically think Valor is just better overall in this matchup, but I did want to show that this is the impact Maxi can have versus Agents, and this is going to apply to every deck that runs an Agent engine. And I would say Agents is like referring to like Chaos Agents. This deck runs cards like it runs Tour Guide, it also runs Venus, and I think both those are like the main cards Agents see as impacted for Maxi. But there's also like Birdman plays in Chaos Agents, and even things like Junk Synchron. Yeah, that's it. So even things like Junk Synchron, which can like be kind of problematic. Like those like Junk Synchron is a big target where like you're gonna actually see a lot of value on the Maxi, because you're basically always guaranteed at least a +1 off of a Junk Synchron play. So and that's also why some people don't run it. So it just kind of depends. It's not a necessary card, but it has its benefits and its drawbacks. But I would say overall, I think Agents is hurt by Maxi. And I'd say the TG Agents plays a lot more of a slow, controlled game. It runs like the only special summon it's really doing that like you could chain Maxi to is going to be like either your Venus into Shine Balls or potentially like Striker into Warwolf. And even then, I'd say that's not super impactful. So we're going to put minimal impact here. It's just really not like that oppressive. So this is Diva Hero, and Diva Hero has a lot of points where actually Maxi hurts, I'd say. Like, for example, banish a Malicious for another one, and then normal a Diva. Like, you can get blown out really hard there. They also like to go into Leviair and stuff like that quite frequently. I would say that Diva Hero has some moments where it's, like, pretty impacted. I don't think it's wrecked by Maxi, but I would put it probably up here with hurt by Maxi. Okay, and then next we have Water Synchro, which is basically like a Tengu Plant variant that's like running a Frog engine. I think like because it's so similar to Tengu Plants, you just throw it right up here with Plants as the hurt by Maxi. But yeah, and then so this is Gallis FTK. Gallis FTK is really weird in this format. It's like pretty strong, but. And I would say as a whole, if you're making any other play outside of the OTK combo, so like if you're just using like Gallis or a Birdman to make a Synchro play or a special summon play, Maxi hurts. Like it actually hurts. It's going to be at least a +1 or +2. And then like, you know, not to mention you also are running Tour Guide and Venus and stuff like that. So there's actually a lot of targets within this deck. That being said, if you go for the FTK or OTK combo, Maxi doesn't do anything. You're just drawing empty cards because there's no hand trap in the game that can actually stop that combo from happening once you get it. It is a tricky 3-card combo and requires an all-monster deck, but it is worth it. Like Maxi's like good against the deck. It's just if you get hit with that actual combo, it doesn't do anything. So I would say hurt by Maxi in the same way these guys are, but you still can certainly win through Maxi, no problem. Gadgets, this is another one that like has no impact. If we're running like Ultimate Offering, you're really not gonna see like even if you make it, all those summons are counted as normal summons. So like off of Ultimate Offering, so the only time they're gonna draw off the Maxi is when you go for your Exceeds, which means like the first time they pitch the Maxi, that's going to be the like -1, and if you decide not to exceed, then that's fine. But even if you want to exceed twice, you can give your opponent a +1 to have a full board of Gadgets plus like a Roach and a Utopia, and you're fine. So yeah, definitely no impact there. Maxi doesn't really do anything to stop this. I'd say Valor is way more impactful in this matchup. This is Herald of Perfection. This is pretty similar to it's basically just Agents with a Herald engine. I would say that it has Tour Guide and Venus just like the other decks, but at the same time, it also like runs Herald. If you maxi the ritual summon of Herald, you don't really care. You're usually pretty fine to just stop on the Herald play. But yeah, I would say it's maybe slightly more common for the tour guide to actually be an exceed in this deck. But I don't really think it's like super impactful. I would say it's worth keeping in against the deck going second to try to stop the gotchi play. But for the most part, like it's pretty minimal impact. It's not actually going to see a ton of value in the deck. Yeah, like I said, like Chaos Agents has more cards in it, like Birdman and stuff, that add more playability to the maxi. This is only running the Tour Guide Venus, and it's like it's not that strong. Karakuri, I would say it's hurt by maxi just because this deck really wants to combo off an OTK, and it's not really making any like negation in its board, so like you have no protection, so maxi does hurt Karakuri a decent degree. I will say it's kind of tricky to maxi Karakuri, and I'll show you guys why. I'll show you like the optimal points to do that in a second. All right, so the first situation for Karakuri involves Cyber Dragon. This is usually your combo starter. Some decks, like more modern takes on this, will run Instant Fusion, which actually has a harder maxi punish than Cyber Dragon. Since Cyber Dragon is inherent, you just special summon it, and then you can normal this and additional normal here. So your opponent can't really maxi any of this. If they want to maxi right now, theoretically they could. The issue with that is if you get maxied right here, like you can either choose to stop or just make a Stardust, and it's only going to be a 1-for-1. So in reality, the best time in this situation is on the Synchro Summon. You make the Burrito, and then your opponent chains maxi to the effect. And here you have a couple options. If you want the extra protection, you can go for Saizan and just make a Stardust, so they're going to draw 2. Or you can just go ahead and make like a Strategist, and so they're going to draw 1, and then the Strategist will switch, triggering Burrito, allowing you to draw a card. Which then means that like it's like a pretty even trade here, so you're fine giving them that extra draw if you want to Synchro. So like you can Synchro for 7 and make like a Landois, for example, and they'll get the second draw. That's like if you want to give it to them. Otherwise you could stop right there and just get like, you know, actually gain more value out of it. Or again, like I said, go for Stardust if you want, but I kind of like this a bit better as long as you're not afraid of Dark Hole, just because you get the extra draw, which really kind of evens out the card advantage. But yeah, so overall, like Karakuri, like it has its points where maxi is like pretty good, but it's not really that game-breakingly strong. Piper Chaos, this is another Chaos deck where no impact. Like you can chain to a Kinkabayo, but that's a single special summon. Like this deck can like pass really easily, like with Battle Faders and stuff like that. Doesn't really have any issue like that. So I would say no impact for Piper Chaos. Zombies, this is a weird one. I think I'd place it in minimal impact. That's because of the fact that for the most part, like outside of like Tour Guide into Levier, again, to bring back a banished zombie, you're really not special summoning that much. A lot of your pushes, like you're like single push with like Mizuki and Plague. That's where like you have, like sometimes you have to make a play, and that's where maxi can really hurt. But overall, like a lot of the time you're just using like the Mizuki to bring back a Goblin Zombie and tribute for Caius. Like this build plays way more around tributing for Caius than it does playing around like synchroing with your zombie plays. So for the most part, I don't really think that maxi hurts the deck all that much. I feel like it can at certain points. But I'd say overall, like Valor is just going to be way better against this deck than maxi ever will. Nordic, I'll put Nordic as hurt by maxi, mostly because like the monsters, you don't really have good stopping points. Like when you summon the Grey Goat, you do that during your opponent's turn, so you don't really have to worry about it. But on your turn, when you switch it to attack to get the tuner, they can chain maxi right there, and you kind of have to commit to the synchro, so you're guaranteed to give your opponent a +1, but it also really like kind of sticks your plays down a bit. So that's where like Nordic feels the impact a bit more. But it's still super playable through maxi. It's not a huge deal, just like the rest of these guys. Gladiator Beasts, so this is a really weird one to place, because if we're talking like with the hero lives, like a Hero Lives into Prisma with Test Tiger, if you chain Maxi to that Hero Lives, the Gladiator Beast player is gonna feel the pain. Like, that's gonna hurt. But if, like, I feel like as a whole, that play is like only relevant in certain situations and it's not coming up a ton, I think like you could make a case for keeping Maxi in, but there's also a world where the deck just plays a control style and like, or even is running like War Chariot to stop it. So like, I would say minimal impact, because 9 times out of 10, the deck is playing like a slow control way and it's not actually like doing those big pushes. If you can hit them on that big push, it feels good. But overall, I think Valor is just better, because you'd rather just Valor the Geyseris at the end of the play than try to like have Maxi where it's like really not getting a lot of value outside of that single situation, right? Gravekeepers, the only special summon this deck does is flipping Spy. Valor is just better, for sure. And also you run the risk with any hand trap of getting Royal Tributed, so like that doesn't feel very good. But yeah, Maxi doesn't do anything to this deck. Same thing goes for Psychic. The only thing you could do is like if your opponent is summoning Esper Girl on the standby phase and you want to like and they want to chain a Warwolf so they don't have to use their normal summon for the Synchro play. If you Maxi that Esper Girl, then you can draw a lot of cards off that scenario. But as the Psychic player, you're not really forced, unless you're like in a weird, really bad situation, you're not really forced to commit to making those Synchro plays. You can happily just let that Esper Girl summon. You could like set the Warwolf and pass, and then the Esper Girl's gonna, if it dies, you're gonna add like the card back. So you're like, your opponent would just -1 really hard off of it. So it's like, it's kind of a risky thing to do. Realistically, you'd want to chain to the Warwolf effect, which is going to get you a +1. But even then, you're gonna plus off of your Synchro as well. Like, you're gonna make the monster and get the card back. So it's like an even trade. So I would say pretty much no impact for Psychics as well. It really doesn't hurt the deck at all. This deck is rarely like making a bunch of summons in a single turn. Scraps, I'll put at minimal impact. And that's because there are some worlds where like you can plus off of it, like the normal summon of Chimera to bring back Beast into a Scrap Dragon. That's going to be a +1 from the Maxi. Or even the, like, if you normal Scrap Beast in Synchro with a Tengu, that's going to be a +1 too, because Tengu is mandatory. So in that way, like it can give like your opponent like a nice draw. So it's not terrible to keep in if you really wanted it to. But for the most part, like, again, I think Valor is just better. Like, you get so much value off the Scrap Dragon summon that like the Maxi really isn't doing much for you. Macrocosmos is like one of the most true no impact cards by Maxi. Like, with Macro Live, they can't use Maxi, so and then we have Machina Gadgets, pretty much same as Gadgets, even less so. Like, there's no, like, the summon of Fortress is inherent, so like you're not chaining Maxi to anything here, so yeah, you're kind of big chilling. And then Worm, same thing, like you're summoning Yagen off, like they can 1-for-1, but they're not getting any value. So that's where the placements are, right? And so like one of the things that I wanted to kind of stress or talk about is, like, if you look at the decks up top here that are hurt by Maxi, a lot of these are some of the stronger decks of the format, right? Like, we have like between Tengu Plants, Agents, like Chaos Agents, and even like Karakuri. These are like historically really powerful decks at the time, and these are probably the decks that see the most pain from Maxi. But this is why I wanted to stress, like, make this video and kind of show you guys, like, these decks have windows to get Maxi'd, but it's not really all that painful other than very specific scenarios, and like those scenarios don't come up a whole lot. So it's like, is it that bad? Not really, you know? And then like all these decks down here, like there are some of like the strongest decks of the format between like Chaos, Heroes, TGs, and TG Stun. Like, these decks here, a lot of these decks are really powerful and they don't see any impact by Maxi whatsoever. So like, This is also why historically people typically would often run Veiler over Maxx, because at least Veiler can be like normal summon to make a synchro play with if it's like completely dead in the matchup, where Maxx is just like a really useless card if it's dead, right? Like it doesn't do anything. So yeah, like if you really look at it, if we count the number, the 12 decks in the meta that see no impact by Maxx, right? And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decks that see, like, you can Maxx them, but it's probably not the most optimal card to be running against them. So like there are of course other decks in the 2011 format, like, you know, the lower tier decks that do get completely destroyed by Maxx. I think it's always worth to have Maxx within your like either main or side, depending on what deck you're running. And like you also have to consider just how popular the decks that are hurt by Maxx are, making it like a justifiable main deck to a degree, right? Like, I mean, Tengu Plants is like one of the most popular decks of the format. So of course, like Maxx is a pretty good card to run because a lot of people run this. And I'd say Tengu Plants out of all of these probably gets hurt by Maxx the most. Like it really does. So, but again, like that just adds that balance to the format. It really does balance out the format to have Maxx, because it's a punish for the decks that have really high ceilings, that have a lot they can do in a single turn. And that increases the strength of the decks that can't do as much in a single turn. And it allows them to be able to compete pretty nicely against these decks. So it really closes that gap and like and makes it where, like, I'd say all these decks, I mean, I put them all in tier 1 for a reason. Like they're all pretty even in like power level. Just depends on the player and the build, really. So yeah, if there's anything that you can take away from this, I just want you to know that like the decks that get hurt by Maxx, or like Maxx does not really dictate every matchup. Like Maxx doesn't dictate how every matchup goes. It's not like it was in modern Yu-Gi-Oh or like later formats where like if you saw Maxx and your opponent didn't, you just win the game. This format is not nearly as special summon heavy as like other formats. In fact, like it's like literally these are the decks up here that are like relatively special summon heavy, and then all these here are like they special summon, but not enough to like where Maxx is getting a ton of value. So like that's like the reality of the situation, guys. Like it's really not that bad. I would not even put Maxx as like one of the strongest cards in this format at all. Like it's not even close to like being like the most powerful card in the format. Like it sucks to get hit by if you're playing a deck that it hurts, but it also like a lot of decks don't get hurt by it, so it's not like a big deal. And because of that like variance, because of the difference, like all these decks are tier 1, you have an equal chance to run into like any of these, right? Like it also means that running Maxx is almost inherently risky, right? Because like you can just lose to like having the extra dead draws in your deck. Like I don't think I would ever run 3 Maxx in a deck this format. I know there's some builds that do, but I personally would not, just because I think that it's way too risky. I would cap out at 2 at most. But yeah, like it's definitely a card you side out in certain matchups all the time. So like, yeah, it's really not a big deal. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video. If you've made it this far, you know, please consider subscribing. You know, this video actually took me a really long time to put together because there's a lot of research, a lot of clips I had to put together just like to layer this to make it as like clear and clean as possible. So yeah, would definitely appreciate the support. And you know, honestly, like I want to hear your guys' Maxx horror stories in the comment. You know, like I said, I don't think it's very impactful in this format, but I know for a fact in other formats it is just disgusting. So you know, why not share some of those stories in the comments? I'll start out like one of the worst experiences I had was in Zoo format. I was playing like a really cool combo deck I invented. It was like ABC True Jaco Zoo, and I had like a turn 1 combo that could set up like Masterpiece, Dragon Buster plus Dryden, and it was really insane. And my opponent at Nats hit me with the one of Maxx on going like second against me both games. So like turn 1 he hit me with Maxx, and then on the second game turn 1 he hit with Maxx, and I just lost. And then he went on to be like, oh, that deck was so bad. But I was like, what, bro, you saw your one of twice. It was so tilting. So yeah, I don't know, I think it'd be fun. Share your stories, let's hear it. But thank you so much for watching, and make sure you guys have a great time dueling today.